Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, it's been several weeks since we've taken a look at anything regarding current events. Done a fair bit of that lately. Every week or two, I've been taking a look at something that's going on. A lot of it's been centered on Iran lately, but I want to go back to one of the other major geopolitical issues that we've been dealing with over the last several years, and that is the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there was a lot in the news about that in the last few days because Russia just had their big celebration for their version of VE Day, celebrating their victory over Germany in World War II. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding that because of safety concerns about whether or not Ukraine might strike, which seems to fly in the face of what most people understand, that Russia is kind of the offensive party in this war. And so that led me to this video that was made by Warfronts a few days ago. It's called, "Is Ukraine Winning?" Now, that's debatable, but I guess that's the topic we're going to get into today. So I'm in advance just going to ask everybody, as always, to keep your comments civil in the comment section. Debate vigorously. Argue your side passionately, but do so in a way that's respectful of people who might disagree with you. You can disagree without being disagreeable. That's the only thing I ask. And I want to thank Nathaniel in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, for your support on Patreon. He's been supporting the channel since January on Patreon, and we've got a whole bunch of new perks that I rolled out. You may not have even noticed if you're a patron. I updated all of our tiers yesterday. So if you want to check it out, if you've thought about being a patron for a while, now's a great time. The link is down in the description below. You can see what all the perks are. We've added a whole bunch of new stuff, including a bunch of weekly perks for our patrons. And right now they're voting on what the next reaction video will be. So the video after this one will be one that's voted on by our patrons. Let's dive in.
Say whatever you will about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but the man is a consummate professional in the art of rage baiting. Turn back the clock by about a week as of the day that this episode is released, and Russian President Vladimir Putin was trying to work his way through a rather difficult problem.
So here's the thing about Zelenskyy, and I know there's a lot of controversy about him, and a lot of people don't like him, or a lot of people love him. He was an actor, and in fact, I think you can still get on Netflix and see the show that he was on, where he played like a history teacher who ends up running for president and winning. And then a few years later, he ran for president and won. But he does do some things really well. He's very good with PR, and he seems to be very good with kind of saying the things that he needs to say in order to inspire his people. I don't know a lot about his politics. I don't know a lot about what goes on with the government, but I only know what I see. And what I see, I think, is exactly what his country needs right now.
Saturday, the 9th of May, Moscow would hold its annual Victory Day celebration in Red Square to commemorate Soviet victory over Germany in World War II. Unfortunately for Putin, Red Square also happened to be more vulnerable than ever in a year when Ukrainian drones have been able to strike deep into Russian territory, including in the capital city, with ease.
And you have to think about, I don't know how much news is filtering through to the Russian people about all this stuff, how much it's kind of, they're kept from seeing a lot of this. But I just try to imagine if the roles were reversed and if an American president was dealing with the kind of struggles to finish the job with a country like Ukraine the way that Russia has, how that would be perceived in the United States. People would have called for his head a long time ago.
Already, Moscow had announced that it would decline to display military equipment this year, when in a normal year the parade would feature tanks and ballistic missiles. Already, it had become clear that very few foreign dignitaries would be visiting this year, whereas in 2025, Putin enjoyed the parade alongside China's Xi Jinping and Brazil's Lula da Silva. Already, Russia had attempted to unilaterally declare a ceasefire in an effort that went sideways when Ukraine declared its own ceasefire a couple of days earlier, watched as Russia ignored the ceasefire and promptly bombed a kindergarten, and gave itself all the credibility it needed to ignore Russia's ceasefire, just like Russia had ignored its own. Russia was running out of options. The moment of truth was approaching, but just as the day of the parade was approaching, Vladimir Putin got his ceasefire with the aid of US President Donald Trump. That was the moment when a
So Putin, I guess I've never really paid much attention to this, but Putin obviously speaks English, which I guess makes sense since he was a KGB agent. But they're obviously having a conversation there, and I highly doubt that it's because Trump is speaking Russian.
what is ceasefire with the aid of US President Donald Trump. That was the moment when a world-class rage baiter saw his opportunity and seized the initiative with a declaration that captured headlines across the globe. I hereby decree to permit the holding of a parade in the city of Moscow, Russian Federation, on May the 9th, 2026.
That is epic level of rage baiting. That's trolling 101 right there. Yes, Moscow will permit you to have your parade in the city. And this was, obviously after news reports are already coming out where Russia is saying, well, we're not going to display any military vehicles because of the potential threat from drones. I mean, we are seeing, we see this all the time in history, where you see wars that aren't necessarily on a huge scale. Not that I'm saying this is a small war. I mean, this is Russia and Ukraine. This is a pretty big deal. But it's not like a World War II level thing. But we see a lot in history where wars between maybe single nations become the place where we see what the next big war may look like as far as the nature of warfare. And we're seeing a lot of that here, right, with the heavy use of drones, not just big drones, but like the small anti-personnel drones, the ones that are hitting individual soldiers and exploding. But we're also seeing a lot of trench warfare and things like that. So it's this weird mix of like 100 years ago and 20 years from now kind of thing. But we're seeing how warfare plays out. And I have to think that every nation on earth is watching all of this and is adjusting accordingly as far as our plans for whatever capabilities we might need for the future.
End quotes. Russia's parade would go forward. It would proceed without violence, but only because Vladimir Putin had needed to call on Donald Trump to ask big bad Mr. Zelenskyy to let him have his parade in peace. For most of the rest of the world, it was a diplomatic display that seemed rather petty, the sort of thing that a particularly uncouth foreign leader might try because they could, but one that wouldn't make much of an impact. Yet Volodymyr Zelenskyy's sick burn was something more. A moment when Zelenskyy said the quiet part out loud in front of the entire world. By the time Russian troops marched through Red Square, it had already been clear for a little while that the tides are starting to turn on the Ukrainian battlefield. Zelenskyy might have added some pretty serious insult to Russia's injury, but the injuries were already there, and now they are only getting worse. Now, before we get into all the ways that Putin's war is starting to turn against him, we've got to spend another minute or two on this Victory Day parade, and specifically the impact of Zelenskyy's decree that Ukraine wouldn't attack Moscow. Again, this is the kind of statement that's really easy to dismiss. Zelenskyy had demonstrated the power to hit Moscow. He was probably under political pressure to accept a ceasefire, and he decided to be a bit of a dick about it.
Yeah, that's a great point here. He's not saying this without some backing of it, right? I mean, they have hit Moscow before with drones and things like that. So, I mean, he's not just trolling without some level of possibility of it even really being true.
Because he could. But one of the unique, chronically underappreciated things about Russia's political system, especially under Vladimir Putin, is the degree to which insults like that can really matter. Deep under the veneer of state politics, Russia and its elite have a tendency to play by prison rules, and for someone to talk shit and get away with it should be unthinkable. But don't take it from us, take it from the absolutely ballistic response of Russia's mill bloggers. For example, the account Donetsk Infantry said, "The shame for the Russian government isn't that the Ukrainian dictator issued such decree, it's that the authorities, who allowed Russia's defense capabilities to be plundered, have been begging for a deal since 2014. If you," meaning Russia's leaders, "constantly obstruct a fighting army so as not to complicate negotiations, if you make grand gestures and supply gas and oil to those who kill Russians, you will be treated as you deserve." Or maybe the account Bluebeard, quoting again, "Entering the circus ring with a professional clown was a stupid idea from the start. Show politics is like breathing through his nose vein. It's impossible to outplay the Ukrainians on this field."
That's a great point there, is, in a war such as what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, where yes, there's movement, and yes, there are things that are happening, but for the most part, over the last, 3+ years, it feels a little bit like a stalemate. at least from the outside looking in. I'm sure it doesn't feel that way to people on the ground. In that situation, the war then gets fought in the public square, and fighting through show politics becomes what a lot of this is about, especially because if you're Zelenskyy, so much of what you're relying on is what you are able to convince the outside world to come in and help you with. I think all the way back to the American Revolution. What turned the tide in the American Revolution? It wasn't the United States winning great victories on the battlefield. It was the United States winning a victory on the battlefield at Saratoga that they were then able to turn around and sell to governments like France and say, look, we can win this. We just need some help. But we've shown you. And it was that show politics aspect to it. And so by Ukraine kind of standing as they have, even though they've taken some pretty big hits, and then publicly projecting the way that Zelenskyy is, there's a lot behind the scenes that can go on with that.
Or the account, two majors quoting again. The bastard knows how to wage an information war. For such a slap in the face, a blow against Kiev could be launched right now.
So these are pro-Russia comments, right? I mean, but even they're like, oh man, yeah, that was a pretty good shot by Zelenskyy there, and we need to respond to that. Why aren't we doing anything?
Then there's the account DSHRG Rusich, quoting again, is this denazification or demilitarization? We can't figure it out. Then there's Novorossiya militia reports saying, after elevating this worthless individual, meaning Zelenskyy, for 4 years, they've now given him a perfect opportunity to troll and laugh. Are you satisfied?
Wow.
And then there's Lev Vershinin. To be honest, I can't recall a second public spitting on such a level. And finally, although we could absolutely do this all day, the account shelter number 8, the old-timers themselves gave the opportunity to troll themselves. Overall, the consensus is quite clear. Among the ultra-nationalist, tuned-in war watchers who support Putin's needs quite badly, Zelenskyy's declaration was such a brazen attempt to humiliate Russia that the correct response would have been to exert overwhelming force.
And that, of course, then I'm sure he's going to get into, begs the question, why didn't they? Can they not do it? Or were they trying? I mean, there's something to be said, if you're Russia, for ignoring it and trying to kind of belittle it and say, yeah, we're not paying attention to the ravings of a madman who really isn't able to back it up. You can take that route, but what these guys are all saying is, no, you need to answer, and you should have answered in a significant way. And the fact that you didn't, does that mean you can't?
Instead, as of the time of writing, Russia has not engaged in any substantive effort to retaliate or save face, and has moved forward with a scheduled prisoner deal, 1,000 for 1,000, that was agreed as an element of the ceasefire. Then there was Putin himself at the parade, visibly haggard, seemingly quite distressed at certain moments, surrounded by much more security than usual, and leaving the premises as quickly as his legs could carry him once the victory march had concluded. Even less characteristic of Putin were his statements later on Victory Day after the parade, when, speaking to reporters, Putin suggested that the Ukraine conflict was headed toward a conclusion and referred to Ukraine's president not as a dog or as a Nazi, but as, quote, Mr. Zelenskyy.
That's a big deal. I mean, I don't know how much he's referred to him that way in the past, but there does seem to be some legitimacy to a statement like that. And maybe we're on the path to peace. I'd love to see that. I don't know how that looks, because I don't see Ukraine accepting anything that involves the loss of any territory, nor should they, I don't think. But,
For Putin and for Russian and global onlookers, the events of Victory Day 2026 would have been practically unthinkable even a year ago.
Wow.
From the decision to withdraw heavy military equipment, to the embarrassment around Russia's requests for a ceasefire, the build-up to the parade acknowledged a bitter reality that Putin has refused to acknowledge out loud. Russia is still engaged with Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, but Moscow lacks the means to force Kiev to bend to its will. At most points throughout this war, with Ukraine badly overstretched on the front line and in desperate need of more resources, provoking Moscow like this would have been unthinkable. And in most phases during the war, it would have been equally unthinkable that Russia would have absorbed the insults of the last week without a substantive response. Historically, Vladimir Putin has been incredibly resilient to crises that would tank most leaders' careers, from mismanaged military and environmental disasters, to economic malaise, to sanctions, to forced digital blackouts and more. But it's not at all certain that Vladimir Putin is a leader who can let insults of this magnitude go unpunished without subtly revealing that Russia's emperor has no clothes. Now, of course, our Warfronts team does know our audience fairly well at this point, and we can expect that by now a fair share of the people watching this episode would like to raise a couple of counterpoints. Number one, are we making...
This is good. I'm glad they're going to raise some counterpoints. It's good to try and present a balanced view. This has so far been kind of like, hey, not a good look for Russia. What's the other side of it?
A bit much out of an admittedly sick burn with no bearing on the rest of the conflict. And number two, is it really that big of a deal if Moscow wasn't actually attacked during the Victory Day parade? And number three, aren't we falling into the very same trap that so many Western analysts struggle to avoid? The same one that we pointed out in an episode just days ago, where people capitalize on even the slightest signs of Vladimir Putin's weakness and overexcitedly insist that his downfall is oh so imminent.
See, I feel like that point where that might have been a possibility passed a couple of years ago, where you had that general who was kind of making his way toward Moscow and then ended up striking a deal and then ended up mysteriously dying not long after. I feel like that was probably about as close as you were going to get to a real threat to Putin's power in all of this.
And to that, we'd simply offer that you are absolutely right to ask the question, because if the problem was simply that Vladimir Putin had a bad Victory Day this year, then this all just might be a non-story. But the real danger for Putin, in a moment like this one, is that a single symbolic display might confirm something that the world, and especially Russians, already suspected. Under fire. Putin's situation on the home front was already deteriorating fast before the events of Victory Day 2026. A small handful of high-profile Kremlin insiders had started to speak publicly against Putin, and as of the time of writing, they appear to still be active.
It's interesting. At least on the outside looking in, I always thought that was kind of a thing that just didn't really happen a whole lot, at least within Russia. Glad to be proven wrong on that.
Making matters worse, hundreds of ordinary Russians have started airing their own frustrations with Moscow on social media, occasionally interrupted by forced digital blackouts that have only raised tensions further. A growing number of reports suggest that Putin's paranoia has reached new heights, that he's been living out of bunkers, and that he fears a palace coup or even an attempt on his life. If you'd like to learn more about Putin's domestic struggles, well, we covered the situation in detail in an episode just last week. Check it out. Now, the events of the 9th of May won't win back any of Putin's support amongst Russian citizens, or more importantly, among the Russian elite. But the day was especially troubling for Putin because it reinforces the problems he's facing on the battlefield. Russia's fight against Ukraine has always been more of a challenge than the Kremlin bargained for, but since the start of this year, Ukraine has begun to pull ahead of Russian capabilities in many ways at once.
Really?
On the battlefield itself, and within a few dozen kilometers of the Russian line of contact, Ukraine is largely holding its ground. Over the last several months, Ukrainian forces have managed to offset Russia's dismal territorial gains by capturing territory elsewhere, particularly in the nation's south, while Russian soldiers creep forward in the eastern Donbass region. Even there, Russian forces are moving very slowly, while in the north, and especially around the Sumy region, Russian troops are capturing territory with little, if any, practical value. Instead, they're taking over abandoned patches of land that Ukraine hasn't tried to defend for several months, possibly.
And this is what you have to do when you're Ukraine and you're outgunned in every way, and manpower and weapons, all of that. You have to pick and choose your battles, and you have to make stands at key points, but then let them take worthless territory, like he's saying here.
The Kremlin statisticians can try to win the messaging battle over territorial gains and losses. Even in areas where Russian forces are slowly grinding forward, they're encountering another problem: Ukraine's vaunted Fortress Belt. A line of heavily entrenched positions, the Fortress Belt was built to deter and, if necessary, contain a Russian advance, and it was built for precisely that purpose. Fighting from within their fortress belt, Ukrainian troops have all the supplies, the hiding positions, and the ammunition, especially drones, that they need to bleed the Russian advance dry. Ukraine recently introduced combat-capable unmanned ground vehicles at scale, allowing Kiev to keep more of its soldiers safe in a way that Russian leadership isn't interested in trying to replicate.
So now we're seeing like ground drones, unmanned machine gun vehicles. I mean, this is the future, right? I mean, this is what we're dealing with. How much of combat is going to be happening between unmanned vehicles on both sides, which in a sense is a good thing because hopefully it means fewer deaths, but it might prolong the wars because you're not inflicting real casualties. You're just inflicting casualties upon weapons and supplies and money, right? And that's, if you're Ukraine, you're using the same strategy that most smaller nations have had to use against larger ones, which is outlast until the public turns against it, until it's no longer feasible to keep funding it. We see that all throughout history.
For a fighting force that's mostly playing defense, like Ukraine, it's never good when the enemy is advancing. But some enemy advances are better than others. Right now, Ukraine is imposing very high costs on Russian soldiers as they push forward.
And sometimes you're going to let the enemy advance. This is what we call we call Fabian tactics, right? Where you fall back, fall back, fall back, fall back. And then when you've drawn the enemy in deep away from his supply lines, you've stretched him out, you've exhausted him, then you turn and strike. It's how Texas won its War of Independence. It's what Nathaniel Greene did in the Carolinas during the American Revolution. It's a strategy that has worked throughout history.
When Ukraine does give ground, it's been able to lead Russia forward in the direction of very well-defended positions. Russian troops have little choice but to follow. After all, their commanding officers have made it clear for a long time now that they value forward territorial captures more than they value tactical sensibility. Ukraine's been so effective at luring those soldiers to their preferred areas of engagement because of what Ukraine's been able to accomplish at medium range.
So I have to wonder why it is that Russia has stated that they value territorial gains. I mean, number one, is it because that's what they're getting, and so they want to create the illusion, right or wrong, of victory by saying this is what our goal is and we're achieving our goal? Or is this what they're being told from on high, is that that's your strategy, is take territory? And so even maybe the troops on the ground are saying, this isn't really helping us, but this is what we're being told is our goal here.
There, Ukraine's leveraging very advanced drone technology, AI-enabled models that can guide themselves to a medium-range target and even carry out a precision strike if necessary with no need for human input. That means these drones don't have to send signals back to human operators, and that means that Russia's jamming technology...
I was about to say, that means that removes, and this is one of those adjustments, right? Because at the beginning of the war, you had a lot of drones being used, and then what always happens in war is the enemy tries to counter that technology by coming up with a technology of its own, which means then you need to adjust to override that counter that has come up with. So if you were using drones and then they started jamming drones, well, now you've got to have drones that don't need a signal or that are fly by wire for short range.
Is functionally irrelevant. Those drones have been able to devastate the Russian back lines, where soldiers prepare to move toward the front, ammunition stockpiles are built up and drawn upon, and food, medicine, and other critical supplies are often left relatively exposed. According to recent evaluations by several conflict experts, Ukraine appears to be able to strike so far into Russian-controlled territory that it can hit the road and rail infrastructure that allows Russia to sustain Crimea by land.
And this is exactly what you need to do if you're Ukraine. You have to pick and choose your battles, and supply lines are a great way to strike if you can't go toe-to-toe on scale.
As of now, Ukrainian drones strike with impunity all across the region near the Sea of Azov, compromising Russia's ability to defend and protect the Crimean Isthmus. One Russian drone developer wrote online that because of Ukraine's success, Russia has had to restrict the size of its logistical convoys in Donetsk so that just 2 trucks are allowed to travel together at a time. Because of these nagging strikes at mid-range, Ukraine has made Russia's planned spring and summer offensive impossible in the way that it was originally drawn up. Not by meeting force with force, but by kicking out the supports that would have allowed the offensive to succeed. As a result, Russian forces...
That's smart warfare. I mean, that just makes sense. You have to, and I have to wonder, too, if even if they're not necessarily getting a great deal of weapons and logistics from places like the United States, I wonder if there isn't some... at least advising going on.
At the front have become highly reactive, seeking advantages whenever and wherever possible, meaning they're more easily led into traps and disadvantageous positions. Finally, at long range, Ukraine's strikes against Russian energy infrastructure and its military-industrial complex show no signs of stopping. On the Black Sea, on the Baltic Sea, and deeper into Russian territory, all refineries and export terminals have been under constant attack, including some that have weathered direct hits several times each within the span of just a couple of weeks. Russian manufacturing centers, ammunition factories, and weapons assembly lines have faced a similarly grave threat. Those problems have been made all the worse in the lead-up to Victory Day celebration, as Russia diverted air defenses away from relatively remote areas toward Moscow and St. Petersburg. While those air defenses often weren't protecting very much in their immediate vicinity, they were critical in monitoring zones where Ukrainian drones could be detected as they passed through on their way to a more important target elsewhere. In that role, remote air defenses could provide advanced warning of incoming attacks and trim away at drone swarms so that air defense systems at the target destination aren't at risk of being overwhelmed. At close, medium, and long range, Russia has only made its problems worse. When Russia's Starlink access was cut off a few months ago, Moscow lost many of its most important battlefield communication capability.
And this is the risk that you run when you have to rely on technology that comes from outside your country, right? And that's true for any country. If the United States has got to rely, for example, on getting computer chips from Taiwan, well, what happens if China invades Taiwan? Where do you get those from? If you're relying on other nations for resources, for supplies, for manufactured goods, for technology, you have to have some backup plan if it's taken away.
But because of years of corruption, mismanagement, and poor design and implementation, Russia has no alternative system to fill the void. When Russia decided to cut off access to the messaging app Telegram, it made the problem even worse for unit leaders at the front who had relied on the app to coordinate with each other in a pinch. And despite nearly incomprehensible losses, Russia has continued to try and press forward. On the 9th of May, one of the leading trackers of Russian battlefield fatalities, like Russian XR outlets Meduza and Mediazona, found that 352,000 Russian troops have been...
Let's put this in perspective for a second. This is about 100,000 less than the United States lost in all of World War II, right? I mean, this is 3 times what the U.S. I'm speaking as an American, right? So 3 times what the U.S. lost in World War I in dead. This is about half as many as what the British Army lost in World War I in 4 years. I think they had about 700,000 dead in the Army. I mean, it may have been as many as 1 million by the time you count the Navy and Air Forces and civilian deaths and other losses. But I think Army battle deaths were around 700,000. This is a substantial chunk. This is 5 times what the U.S. No, 6 or 7 times what the U.S. lost in Vietnam.
Killed in the war through the end of 2025, according to close analysis of Russian probate records. The figure doesn't include members of paramilitary groups, it doesn't include foreigners like North Koreans or forcibly conscripted African migrants, and it doesn't include the wounded, the missing, or prisoners of war. That is 352,000 fatalities. Nor does that estimate include any of the fighting in 2026, where other estimates suggest that Russia is losing around 35,000 soldiers each month, outpacing recruitment rates since roughly the start of this year. In a situation like this one, Putin might have looked to the rest of the world to find some relief. But global geopolitics just aren't cooperating.
Nope.
Ukraine's long-range strikes against Baltic Sea targets aren't without risk. Just this weekend, the Minister of Defense in NATO member Latvia was forced to resign after a pair of Ukrainian drones wandered over the border from Russia and destroyed oil storage containers on their journey north. It's relatively common that Ukrainian drone debris has fallen upon the NATO countries that lie along their northward route, but those accidents haven't led to any international incidents. Instead, those nations have given Ukraine grace, met its drone operators with patience and understanding, and doubled down on the idea that Putin shouldn't have started this war in the first place. Even when a Ukrainian sea drone turned up in Greek waters last week, discovered in a coastal cave by a fisherman while packed with high explosives, the drone was detonated safely with no public display of frustration from the Greek government. Ukraine just received 90 billion euros in European Union funding, and as a handful of frustrated Russian mill bloggers have pointed out, those 90 billion will assist a Ukrainian war economy that's already survived much longer than the Kremlin had predicted it would. Farther from Eastern Europe, the war in Iran appears to be on the brink of flaring up again, and is nowhere close to a resolution. If Russia had been able to engage in the full-scale export of oil at high prices, as it had intended to do, then the prolonged war could be a massive help to the Kremlin. But with Ukraine's long-range strikes against its export terminals, that opportunity has largely been lost.
And that's a great point in all of this, is that Russia it's not completely isolated, but it's fairly isolated, at least from the West, in terms of all of this. And that's why you get, even though Ukraine might make some mistakes along the way and there might be collateral damage in neighboring nations, they're just, people are accepting that that's part of what happens when you border a war zone.
Instead, Ukraine seems to have set the goal that Russian exports should be carbon neutral by 2027, and they're already well on their way. While Iran is otherwise engaged, Chinese leadership will welcome a visit from US President Donald Trump this week, and there's no telling what could come out of that meeting until it happens, good or bad for Russia. And when this week Russia made a suggestion to Europe that former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder should be the European mediator in talks to end the Ukraine war, European leaders practically laughed in Russia's face. For Moscow, Schröder was a safe suggestion. He was a former German leader, but also shares close ties with Moscow, especially with state-owned energy companies. In fact,
a guy who has images like that with Putin is not the guy that the West is going to be okay with.
He was accused by Russia's now-deceased opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, of being, quote, paid by Putin. Strange as it may seem, Schröder may have been a genuine attempt by Russia to offer a level of compromise in a candidate.
Right. I mean, this is an attempt by Russia to say, hey, we're willing to negotiate. Just give us somebody who's not going to be completely against us.
Who has deep ties to Europe and deep ties to Russia itself. Whether or not Europe would ever have agreed to such an idea after Schröder has been largely disgraced due to his ties with Putin is an open question. But in a world where Europe felt that it is still hard to appease Putin in an attempt to get him to the negotiating table, Schröder might have turned into a real candidate to lead the talks. Instead, European leaders enthusiastically shot down the idea. And it's hardly a coincidence that Europe's chronically overcautious leadership would be willing to do such a thing after Putin's victory day delivered him the black eye of a lifetime. Take all that context together, from Russia's frontline disorganization to its backline vulnerability to its staggering troop fatalities, and the events of Russia's victory day take on a different meaning. The Kremlin has had to make the sorts of tough decisions that were once unthinkable. Put away the tanks, sacrifice other targets to defend Moscow's airspace, and when Volodymyr Zelenskyy comes along to rub the situation in Russia's face, sit there and f***ing take it. Here at War Fronts, we can't see inside of the mind of Vladimir Putin, thank God, but we can see the man that the whole world saw on the 9th of May, a paranoid, exhausted, withering old man who understands the danger all around him, but who hasn't yet worked out a way to avoid it.
All right, that was good. Obviously, a very pro-Ukraine view on things, and so I'm sure some of you out there will have a differing view on that information. Let us know in the comment section below. I want to thank David Neal and Jeffrey Hyatt for your support on Patreon. And please, check out the Patreon updates. Check out the new perks that are available and consider signing up now more than ever. Support on Patreon is everything on YouTube, so thank you in advance. Thanks for watching.